the human imagination is a vast, uncharted labyrinth capable of conjuring the most magnificent architectures of beauty, but equally adept at plunging into the deepest, coldest abysses of terror. For centuries, the act of storytelling has allowed us to explore the hidden undercurrents of the human condition, acting as a safe sandbox where the darker impulses of society can be examined, dissected, and ultimately understood from a comfortable distance. Authors of crime fiction, psychological thrillers, and dark tragedies spend countless hours deeply immersed in the mechanics of malice, meticulously mapping out the precise anatomy of a betrayal, the slow, agonizing progression of a rare poison, or the frantic, desperate choreography of a fatal confrontation. Within the literary community, there is a long-standing, almost universal jest regarding the inherently suspicious nature of a writer's internet search history, which is often a digital archive cluttered with inquiries about forensic decomposition, ballistic trajectories, the structural integrity of human bone, and the most effective ways to dispose of incriminating evidence without leaving a trace. We laugh at these anomalies because we operate under the comforting assumption that the creator is fundamentally distinct from the creation, serving merely as an objective observer, a specialized tour guide leading us through a simulated house of horrors before safely returning us to our quiet, well-lit realities where safety and law reign supreme. Yet, history occasionally presents us with chilling anomalies that shatter this comforting illusion entirely. Moments when the fragile boundary separating the ink on the parchment from the blood on the floor completely evaporates into thin air. There is a specific, profoundly unsettling horror that manifests when we realize that the very hand that crafted beautiful prose, the mind that devised complex puzzles for readers to solve, was simultaneously harboring a genuine, calculated capacity for real-world destruction. It forces us to reevaluate the relationship between artistic genius and psychological instability, questioning whether the vividness of their fictional worlds was a byproduct of their brilliance or a symptom of a much deeper, far more dangerous internal pathology. When the brilliant facade of literary accomplishment drops away to reveal the cold, calculating gaze of a predator, the stories they left behind take on a distinctly sinister, haunting resonance that changes how we read every single line. Before we fully pull back the curtain on these dark chapters of literary history and explore the shocking cases where famous authors stepped out of the shadows of fiction to become the literal villains of their own reality, take a brief moment to join our community by subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications. By doing so, you ensure that you will never miss our deep, meticulously researched explorations into the most fascinating and enigmatic mysteries of human history, crime, and the arts, allowing us to continue unraveling these complex narratives together as we journey into the dark, to understand how a mind can seamlessly transition from the realm of creative expression to the execution of a cold-blooded murder. We must first travel backward in time to the mid-20th century, to a sensational and deeply tragic case that unfolded against the picturesque backdrop of Christchurch, New Zealand. In the early 1950s, a remarkably intense and insular friendship formed between two teenage girls, Pauline Parker and Juliette Hulme, the latter of whom would eventually achieve global fame under the pseudonym Anne Perry. Juliette was an exceptionally intelligent, highly imaginative British girl who had relocated to New Zealand due to health complications, while Pauline was a brilliant but brooding local youth who found in Juliette a kindred spirit. Bound together by a shared sense of intellectual superiority and an overwhelming disdain for the mundane realities of ordinary adolescent life, the two girls constructed an extraordinarily elaborate, deeply immersive fantasy world they called the Fourth Dimension. This private universe was populated by its own pantheon of deities, historical figures, and contemporary cinematic celebrities, whom the girls worshipped with an almost religious fervor, documenting their intricate mythologies in extensive diaries and collaborative novels. Over time, this psychological isolation created an echo chamber so profound that the boundaries of external morality began to completely erode, replaced by a fierce, codependent loyalty that viewed any threat of separation not merely as an inconvenience, but as an existential catastrophe that had to be averted at all costs. The catalyst for violence arrived when Juliette's parents announced their impending divorce, accompanied by a plan to send Juliette away from New Zealand, a decision that threatened to permanently sever the intense bond between the two teenagers. Desperate to remain together and consumed by a distorted adolescent logic, the girls came to believe that Pauline's mother, Honora Mary Reaper, was the primary obstacle standing in the way of their eternal companionship and future literary success. On a seemingly ordinary winter afternoon in June 1954, the girls convinced Honora to accompany them on a walk through Victoria Park, a scenic reserve overlooking the city, under the pretense of a peaceful family outing. Deep within a secluded wooded path, the girls enacted a brutal, premeditated plan, striking the unsuspecting mother repeatedly in the head with a half-brick wrapped tightly inside an old stocking. The sheer ferocity of the attack, which required dozens of blows to finally silence the victim, utterly shocked the local community and sent shockwaves through the international press when the details of the crime were laid bare in court. The subsequent trial became a sensational media spectacle, focusing heavily on the girls' intense, borderline obsessive letters, their mutual dreams of literary stardom, and the chilling lack of remorse exhibited by the young defendants, both of whom were ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison due to their minor status. Upon their eventual release from prison, the state mandated a total erasure of their pasts, granting them completely new identities and issuing a strict lifetime injunction forbidding them from ever contacting one another again, under the threat of permanent incarceration. Juliette Holm returned to the United Kingdom, reinventing herself entirely as Anne Perry, a name that would eventually become synonymous with high-quality historical detective fiction, particularly through her acclaimed William Monk and Thomas Pitt novel series. For decades, she lived a highly successful, respectable life as a celebrated literary figure, hiding her dark past in plain sight while writing stories centered entirely on crime, justice, and moral redemption. The illusion remained perfectly intact until 1994, when filmmaker Peter Jackson dramatized the infamous New Zealand murder in the critically acclaimed movie Heavenly Creatures, prompting investigative journalists to dig into the background of the real-world figures, ultimately unmasking the famous novelist as the convicted teenage killer. Decades later, when reflecting on the tragedy during an interview, she confessed that the sheer panic of her parents' divorce, combined with a misplaced, desperate belief that her friend would commit suicide if she didn't assist her, had completely clouded her judgment, illustrating how easily a mind capable of great literary creation can be warped by its own internal narratives. The shocking unmasking of Juliette Holm as the celebrated novelist Anne Perry proved that the darker currents of the human mind can remain hidden beneath a veneer of artistic respectability for decades. But it is far from an isolated incident in the annals of literary history. In the modern era, the intersection of creative ambition, financial desperation, and calculated violence has produced narratives that are even more chilling because they unfold in real time, captured by modern forensics and digital surveillance. Consider the deeply disturbing case of Kouri Richins, an American author who specialized in a genre that would seem entirely incompatible with cold-blooded malice, children's literature designed to heal emotional trauma. In the early 2020s, Richins was living a seemingly prosperous life in Utah as a successful real estate businesswoman, a mother to 3 young boys, and the wife of Eric Richins, a well-liked local businessman. However, beneath the surface of this picture-perfect suburban existence lay a crushing financial reality, with the couple quietly accumulating a staggering $4 million in debt, largely driven by Kouri's aggressive real estate acquisitions. Driven by the mistaken belief that she would instantly inherit her husband's substantial $4 million estate upon his demise, and allegedly planning a completely new life with another man with whom she was having an affair, she began to formulate a lethal exit strategy. On Valentine's Day in 2022, Kouri made her first documented attempt on her husband's life, lacing a sandwich with a massive dose of fentanyl, a highly potent synthetic opioid. Eric survived the encounter, though he suffered severe hives, breathing difficulties, and a terrifying blackout that prompted him to confide in friends that he suspected his wife was actively trying to poison him. Undeterred by this initial failure, Kouri waited less than a month to strike again, choosing a night when they were celebrating a successful real estate closing in March 2022. She prepared a specialty cocktail for Eric, secretly infusing the beverage with an astronomical amount of fentanyl, later determined by forensic toxicologists to be more than 5 times the lethal dose for a human being. Eric consumed the drink and died in his bed later that evening, leaving behind a devastated family and a community searching for answers. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Kouri did something that completely defied comprehension. She channeled her husband's tragic passing into a creative endeavor, self-publishing an illustrated children's book titled Are You With Me? which was explicitly marketed as a compassionate tool to help grieving children cope with the sudden agonizing loss of a father. She embarked on a local media promotional tour, appearing on television programs to tearfully discuss how the book was helping her own children process their immense grief, projecting the image of a heartbroken, resilient widow dedicated to public service. However, the meticulously gathered evidence compiled by law enforcement investigators slowly dismantled her carefully constructed narrative piece by piece. Digital forensics traced her secret purchases of illicit fentanyl from an acquaintance. Financial audits exposed her covert attempts to alter Eric's life insurance policies without his knowledge. And an investigation into her book revealed that she hadn't even written the text herself, having paid a ghostwriting company to craft the prose. Arrested in 2023, her high-profile trial concluded in 2026, when she was convicted of aggravated murder and attempted murder, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole on what would have been Eric's birthday. This terrifying sequence of events highlighted an eerie psychological phenomenon where a perpetrator uses the very medium of literature to construct a false alibi, attempting to hide a monstrous act behind a shield of artistic empathy and maternal devotion. This bizarre blurring of reality and fiction is mirrored in international cases where authors have used their actual literary publications as virtual ions, dropping clues into their texts that police would only decipher years later. In Poland, an eccentric intellectual named Krystian Bala fascinated and horrified the nation when his 2003 psychological crime novel, Amok, became the central piece of evidence in a gruesome real-world murder investigation. Years prior, in December 2000, the bound and heavily mutilated body of a local small business owner named Dariusz Januszewski was discovered floating in the Oder River, showing signs of extreme torture before his death. The police investigation stalled completely, hitting a brick wall for nearly 5 years until a perceptive cold case detective received an anonymous tip suggesting that the specific, highly unusual method used to bind Januszewski's hands and loop the rope around his neck was identical to a murder scene described in an obscure self-published novel. When investigators analyzed Bala's book, they discovered an overwhelming number of parallels between the fictional killer's philosophical motivations and Bala's own life, including an obsessive jealousy regarding his estranged wife. The prosecution argued successfully that Bala, driven by the paranoid belief that Januszewski was having an affair with his ex-wife, kidnapped the businessman, tortured him in a secluded location, and then immortalized the entire horrific experience in his novel, arrogant in his belief that the police would view the writing as mere creative expression. The Polish court agreed, convicting Bala of planning and directing the execution of the murder, ultimately sentencing him to 25 years in prison. The case became a landmark study in criminal psychology, illustrating a terrifying level of artistic narcissism, where a killer's desperate need for literary acclaim and recognition completely overrides their instinct for self-preservation, leaving a detailed blueprint of their crime printed on pages sold to the public. The same fatal combination of financial stress and literary hubris manifested in the United States when a prominent romance novelist took her own advice on how to eliminate a spouse too literally. Nancy Crampton Brophy had spent years writing commercial romantic suspense novels with titles like The Wrong Husband and The Wrong Lover, establishing herself as a familiar figure within regional writing chapters in the Pacific Northwest. In 2011, she published a provocative, tongue-in-cheek essay on her personal blog titled How to Murder Your Husband, which meticulously categorized various methods of spousal elimination, explicitly analyzing the pros and cons of poison, knives, and firearms, while warning readers that a killer must be incredibly clever to avoid suspicion. 7 years after writing that essay, the fictional theories became an inescapable reality when her husband, a respected culinary instructor named Daniel Brophy, was found shot to death inside a kitchen at the Oregon Culinary Institute. The initial public reaction was one of profound sympathy for the grieving widow, but as detectives dug into the couple's private lives, a massive web of financial desperation began to unravel. The Brophies were severely struggling to pay their mortgage, yet Nancy had systematically spent thousands of dollars maintaining multiple life insurance policies on Daniel, which totaled more than $1.4 million in potential payouts. Surveillance footage from businesses surrounding the culinary school captured Nancy's vehicle driving around the area at the exact time of the shooting, and a forensic search of her computer history revealed that she had purchased an untraceable ghost gun kit and an extra firearm barrel to complicate ballistic testing during the trial. Prosecutors presented a compelling timeline demonstrating that Nancy had entered the building before students arrived, shot her husband twice in the back and chest as he prepared for his classes, and then returned home to pretend she had just discovered the news. The defense argued desperately that her presence near the crime scene was merely inspiration for a future book she was writing about a woman trapped in a troubled marriage, but the jury found the evidence overwhelming. In 2022, she was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, transforming her satirical essay into a literal confession and providing a chilling example of an author who believed her familiarity with crime fiction made her smart enough to execute the perfect crime in the real world. The chilling reality that an author can view human life as nothing more than raw material for their next publication extends far across the globe, cutting through different cultures and historical eras with devastating consistency. In China, a highly respected literary figure named Liu Yongbiao achieved widespread critical acclaim for his gritty, realistic portrayals of human suffering and moral decay, culminating in his celebrated crime novel titled The Guilty Secret. In the introduction to one of his major books, Liu boldly announced to his readers that he was currently working on a brand new masterpiece titled The Beautiful Writer Who Killed, a psychological thriller that would follow the exploits of an elegant, intelligent female author who managed to successfully evade law enforcement after committing a series of horrific murders. This provocative premise seemed like a brilliant marketing strategy until the summer of 2017, when police officers unexpectedly arrived at Liu's home and arrested him for his direct involvement in a brutal, 22-year-old cold case that had haunted the local region since the mid-90s. When the authorities finally confronted him, Liu reportedly showed no signs of surprise or resistance, calmly stating that he had been waiting for them to arrive for over 2 decades. As if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from his chest, the underlying crime was a horrifyingly violent incident that occurred in 1995, when Liu and an accomplice checked into a local guest house with the pretense of renting a room, but with the secret intention of robbing the other occupants to solve their severe financial difficulties. During the course of the robbery, things escalated into pure chaos, and the 2 men bludgeoned 4 innocent people to death, including a guest who attempted to fight back, the elderly couple who owned and operated the guest house, and their innocent 13-year-old grandson who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. For over 20 years, Liu used the immense psychological guilt and the dark memories of that bloodbath to fuel his literary career, infusing his novels with an authentic, bone-chilling dread that critics praised for its deep psychological realism. Following his conviction and subsequent death sentence, he openly admitted to journalists that the real-world murders had served as the direct inspiration for his dark literary output, proving that his artistic success was entirely built upon the literal graves of his victims. While some authors have used their dark secrets to fuel long, successful careers, others have met a far more immediate and violent end, leaving behind a legacy of absolute horror that shocked the world of children's literature. In 2007, the tranquil community of Shetland, Scotland, was completely shattered by the sudden, deeply disturbing deaths of the beloved children's book author and illustrator Harry Horse and his terminally ill wife, Mandy Horn. Harry Horse was widely celebrated for his whimsical, deeply heartwarming stories and beautiful illustrations, particularly his beloved books featuring a faithful dog named Roo, who brought immense joy to thousands of young readers around the world. When the news of their deaths initially broke, the media reported a deeply romanticized, tragic narrative suggesting that the couple, facing Mandy's painful battle with multiple sclerosis, had entered into a peaceful, dignified suicide pact, dying quietly in each other's arms after taking a massive overdose of prescribed painkillers. However, a meticulous forensic investigation, conducted over the following year, completely demolished this peaceful myth, revealing a scene of unimaginable, frenzied violence that deeply traumatized the first responders who entered the home. The official medical reports revealed that Horse, suffering from a severe, drug-induced psychological breakdown, had turned on his bedridden wife in a manic frenzy, attacking her with a knife and stabbing her more than 30 times as she lay completely helpless. In his delusional state, he then proceeded to slaughter their innocent house pets, including their loyal dog Roo, the very animal that had served as the beloved inspiration for his famous children's books. Finally, the author turned the weapon upon himself, inflicting 47 stab wounds to his own body before slowly bleeding to death on the floor, leaving behind a crime scene described by the attending medical examiner as the most disturbing and horrific he had ever witnessed in his entire professional career. The local authorities initially chose to keep these gruesome details private to protect the family, but Mandy's grieving relatives eventually chose to go public with the absolute truth, wanting to dispel the romanticized myths of a peaceful suicide pact and expose the terrifying reality of a creative mind that had completely descended into total madness. The theme of an author using a horrific real-world crime as the direct foundatio for their creative work is further exemplified by the bizarre and macabre case of the Dutch crime writer Richard Klinkhammer. In 1991, Klinkhammer's wife, a dedicated pediatric nurse named Hannelore, vanished without a single trace from their shared home, immediately casting a heavy shadow of suspicion over her husband, who was known for his volatile personality. Despite conducting extensive searches of the property and interrogating the writer thoroughly, the police found absolutely no physical evidence linking him to her disappearance, and he steadfastly maintained his complete innocence. Shortly after the investigation stalled, Klinkhammer boldly walked into his publisher's office with a completed manuscript titled Wednesday, Mince Day, a deeply grotesque and deeply unsettling novel that meticulously detailed 7 highly creative ways a man could murder his wife and completely dispose of her remains, including putting her body parts through a commercial meat mincer. The horrified publisher instantly rejected the manuscript, but it eventually circulated through the underground literary press, gaining Klinkhammer a strange, macabre notoriety that he actively exploited by giving eccentric television interviews and partying with the cultural elite. Nearly a decade later, the ultimate truth was finally uncovered when a new family purchased the former Klinkhammer residence and hired a construction crew to completely demolish an old, crumbling concrete shed in the backyard. While the workers were breaking through the thick concrete floor and digging into the heavy clay below, they uncovered a preserved human skull, which forensic scientists quickly identified as the remains of Hannelore through her dental records. Klinkhammer was arrested that very night and immediately confessed to the murder, admitting that he had beaten his wife to death with a heavy wooden tool, buried her deep beneath the shed, poured concrete over her grave, and then casually waited 6 full days before reporting her missing to the police. This shocking case provided a terrifying example of a killer who possessed the supreme arrogance to publish the literal mechanics of his crime to the public, hiding his monstrous reality in plain sight under the protective guise of transgressive fiction. The dark intersection of literary genius and violence also deeply impacted the American counterculture movement through the actions of William S. Burroughs, a towering figure of the postmodern Beat generation whose experimental writing style heavily influenced generations of artists. In 1951, long before he achieved global fame for his landmark novels, Burroughs was living a chaotic, substance-fueled existence in Mexico City with his second wife, Joan Vollmer, as they both attempted to evade serious drug and weapon charges in the United States. During a wild, alcohol-soaked gathering with friends in an apartment located directly above a local bar, Burroughs unexpectedly decided to display his marksmanship by declaring to the room that it was time for their infamous William Tell act. He commanded Joan to place a glass filled with water directly on top of her head, laughing as she complied, turning her face away because she admitted she could never stand the sight of blood. Burroughs drew his pistol and fired a single shot, but his aim was catastrophically off, and the bullet struck Joan directly in the temple, killing her almost instantly at the young age of 28 while the horrified guests stared in absolute disbelief. Though he initially attempted to claim it was an accidental misfire, the tragic event profoundly altered the course of his life, and he later admitted that he would have never become a writer without the overwhelming guilt of her death constantly driving him to create. These diverse cases across history reveal a deeply unsettling truth about the human condition: that the capacity for profound artistic creation and absolute moral depravity can comfortably coexist within the exact same mind. Whether driven by sudden financial desperation, deep-seated psychological delusion, or an arrogant belief in their own intellectual superiority, these authors proved that the monsters they conjured on the page were often nothing more than reflections of the darkness lurking within their own hearts. When we read their celebrated works today, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that artistic brilliance offers no guarantee of human empathy, and that the boundary between an author's darkest fiction and a real-world nightmare is often dangerously